Hey everybody, so today I'm going to show you how to make a basic pillow. So you could do, I think 18 by 18 is what I had said. I basically just cut 2 pieces of fabric left over from this thing I'm making, so I just tried to get as big of a pillow as I possibly could. When you make a pillow, again, you don't want it on a stretchy fabric. You want it to be stable. The other thing is you're going to need an opening to turn the pillow once you're ready. So I'm going to do a 4-inch opening, and I'm just going to put it in the center of one side. So I mark it, and I'm not going to sew between those lines. So I'm going to start sewing here, back stitch, go the whole way around till I come to here, and then back stitch to there. Now the other thing, if you're new at sewing, I would definitely mark the corners. So the easiest way to do that is to mark, I'm going to do a 1/2 inch because that's what I'm going to sew at. Mark from one edge and then the other, and that'll help you not miss your pivot points. It's easy to pass them if you're not experienced. So I'm measuring a 1/2 inch in from each side, and where they crisscross each other is where the pivot point will be. So mark the last corner over here, and like I said, I'm going to sew it a 1/2 inch. But really your pillow could be any size that you want. You do need to take into consideration that you're going to lose a 1/2 inch on each side from the seam allowance. So whatever finished size you want, you need to add 1 inch to that. Okay, now the other thing is, again, if you're not experienced, I would definitely pin this. So when you pin, you want your pins to be perpendicular to the edge. And again, I can use my hand as a guide. I'm going to put one in the corner. Normally, I would not actually pin this because I can sew a lot without pins. But I think most of you that are watching are probably beginners. So it's always a good idea to pin it. I had someone ask, is there a way to hand sew a pillow? And you can definitely hand sew it. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you, everybody has to hand stitch the pillow shut. So I will show you that stitch. It's called a ladder stitch or a slip stitch. I'll show you that, and then I will put a couple links, or if I have time, depending on how long this takes, I can show you a couple examples of stitches that you'd want to do. No matter what stitch that you do for the pillow, if you're doing this by hand, you want it to be a stable stitch, and you want them to be pretty tight so that your stuffing doesn't come out of your pillow. So I'm just going around here putting some pins in. A lot of people have trouble pinning when they're beginners, so just what I do is I stick the pin in on a diagonal, and then I use the pin to lift up the fabric, and then with my finger I kind of push it. So that's usually what I teach students, because some people have trouble pinning. Again, just putting one in each corner. Another thing is, if you don't have marking tools, or you want to make sure that you don't sew too far, another thing you can do is where your opening is, you can put 2 pins close to each other so that you don't miss it. That will show, if you put 2 pins close to each other like this, it'll show you that there's that's the opening. So it's different than if you would just go around and see a single pin. Okay, so now I'm going to come over here and get ready to sew. When I sew, I always try to pull the sewing machine towards me so that I have more control over it. Make sure my foot pedal is good. And I'm going to start on the one side of my opening. So 4/8 to me is lining the fabric up with the presser foot when my needle's in the left position. So I'm going to start by back stitching just a couple stitches. And then again, don't sew over your pins. My hand is just guiding the fabric. This was kind of hanging off the edge, which was pulling on it. And like I said before too, you don't want your extra fabric over to the right. You want your extra fabric to the left. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go until I get to my corner. And then once I'm close to where the X is, I'm going to stop. I want my needle in the fabric when I'm doing this so that it stays in place. So then I'll lift up the presser foot. And then I'm going to turn my fabric. Okay, the presser foot that's in there will keep it stable. I probably turned a little too soon. I wasn't lined up with the edge. You'll notice too I don't have my hand back there because I'm guiding this with my front fingers, just making sure that it stays even. The fabric stays even with the edge of the presser foot. Okay, I'm getting close to my corner, so again, I'm going to stop when I get to the X. Make sure your needle's down. Turn your fabric. This is kind of heavy fabric, so it's pulling off to the side, so I'm just trying to lift up on it and make sure that it stays stable. Corner. My fabric moved a little bit, so when I unpin that, I'll readjust it. Close to my X. If you are afraid you're going to pass your X, you can use the hand wheel on the side. Lift up my presser foot and turn. Put the presser foot down. You want to definitely make sure that you don't sew with the presser foot up. Again, when you're a beginner, you definitely want to go a little bit slower when you're doing this. Most machines have a speed stitch on them. I can go pretty fast though. Get close to my last corner. So I'm going to stop. Pivot one last time. Now I'm going to go until I get to my double pins now, because I'm on my last side. Doing 2 pins together just makes it different than a single pin, so that when you're sewing you don't accidentally mistake that last pin for just another pin that was in there. Okay, so now I am aware of where my opening is. Take those pins out. Sew up to my mark and back stitch. Okay, so at this point I'm going to take it out of my machine. Okay, now anytime that you have corners, you want them to be pointy when they're turned. So what you have to do is you've got to cut across the corner on a diagonal. So I'm going to cut across there, making sure that I don't cut my actual stitching. And this will make them pointy. If you've ever turned something and you get rounded corners where they're supposed to be square, then you probably didn't trim it. Okay, so I got my corners off so you can see my stitching is pretty close to where I cut there. Okay, now the last thing I'm going to do before I turn this, and this will help you when it comes to the hand sewing part, is where your opening is. I would definitely finger press that, because you're going to need a fold as a guide when you're hand sewing. So I'm going to finger press the opening part there, and then I'm going to turn it over and do the same thing on the other side. And again, this is going to make sure that I have a fold that I'm going to be hand sewing. So now I'm just going to try and make sure both are folded and that they're lined up with each other. And I finger press this again. Okay, so now you're ready to turn your pillow inside out. So I'm going to reach in here. 4 inches is probably a little small. My hand can't really fit in here good. And you're going to pull the inside of the pillow out. Be careful when you do this that you don't stretch where your back stitching is, because you can end up ripping your fabric. So just take your time and pull a little bit out at a time. You can do pillows in all sorts of shapes too. You could do hearts and stars, but every time you have a corner, don't forget to trim it. And if you have these are outside corners. If you have an inside corner, you definitely want to clip it. Okay, so what I want to do now before I start stuffing this is I want to poke out my corners. So my seam gauge has a pointy part on it. That I'm going to use. You can also use a pen or pencil, but you have to be careful that you don't actually press a hole in the pocket. So I'm just using the seam gauge to press out. There's also point pressers and things like that. You can actually also use a pin. So I'm having trouble getting in there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a pin and I'm going to use the pin to pull out the corner. That way I can get it good because I'm having trouble getting in there with the seam gauge. I also have an actual point presser, a bamboo one, that I can grab as well. Okay, so that's pretty square. So I'm going to go around to the other corners and do the same thing. So I would use your finger to get it pressed out or pushed out as much as you can, then use the seam gauge if you need it. That'll save you some time. So I'm just doing all three first since my hand's in here. And if it really won't get square, that can mean that you didn't trim close enough to the corner. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stuff the pillow. So when you stuff a pillow, you want to try and stuff it more than you think you need it stuffed, because stuffing does get flat over time. The other thing is you do want to break it into smaller pieces first. I would have probably made a 5-inch opening now that I'm doing this because my hand hardly fits in here. Depending on the size of the pillow, you definitely want to sew the corners. So you just take it in smaller pieces and stuff it in there. I'm going to stuff a bunch in first and then I'll show you how to fill in the corners. This is just a fiber fill that I have here. So again, I'm going to do this until I have a good amount of stuffing in the pillow, and then I'll show you how to fill in the corners, because the last thing you want is a pillow with corners that aren't filled in. You can also buy pillow forms, which are basically a pillow that you make a cover for, but it's easy enough to just make your own as well, and then you can make it whatever size you want. If you buy pillow forms, you have to make the cover the size of the pillow form. There's also a way to make an envelope pillow. So what you would do is cut one piece the size that you want, and then you need 2 pieces to make up the back. And so what you do is you have to have them overlap a little bit. Okay, so what I'm doing to fill in the corner is I'm taking smaller pieces and making sure that I shove them in the corners. I'm going to do the bottom 2 corners at this point, the 2 that are furthest away from me. So again, just make sure you have small amounts of stuffing stuffed in there. I'll do the other 2 corners once I'm closer to the top, because sometimes the stuffing does move. This is probably the most time consuming part of making a pillow. There are definitely different kinds of stuffing. And then too, when you're choosing your fabric, like I said before, you definitely don't want a stretchy fabric, but you also want a tighter woven fabric as well for a pillow. If you have fabric that's too loosely woven, this fiberfill will start coming through the holes. And then you'll keep needing to use a lint roller to get the stuffing off the outside. And then when the stuffing comes to the outside, then it's not going to be on the inside. So now that I have a little more of my pillow stuffed, I'm going to go to the top corners and I'm going to push my stuffing to the sides. So if you stop every once in a while and adjust your stuffing on the inside, then you'll get to the point where the stuffing's just going to go right inside of the opening. And like I said, you want to stuff this way more than you think you need, because the stuffing does get flattened out over time. This is a good project. I have a huge bag of stuffing here, so that'll clear up some space. My sewing area. So right now I have all 3 out of the 4 corners stuffed. Once I get some more stuffing in here, I'll go ahead and fill in the 4th corner. So I'm just going to make sure I take some of my stuffing, push it into the corners. Okay, so at this point I have all 4 corners with stuffing pretty much to the corner. I'm going to take a little more into this corner. It'll also tell you when you're looking for stuffing, it'll tell you pretty much on the bag how many things you can stuff with it. So I found these big boxes of stuffing. I think they're like 10 pounds of stuffing. So the box looks like it's not that much, but as soon as you let the vacuum packed air out of it, it ends up being like double the size of the box. And you can do so many stuffed animals with that. So this piece that looks like a, what's it called? A chopstick, is to also help you get the stuffing in. So if your hand doesn't fit in the opening, you can use that tool to push it in there. Pretty much every bag of stuffing comes with one. Okay, so now that I'm getting more full, what I'm going to do again is I'm going to move my stuffing to the edges of the pillow so that what I'm stuffing is then the middle of it. And if you do that every once in a while, it will make sure that you do stuff the whole thing and don't have any spots. Most of the time when you make a pillow, you can wash it after you make it. I would definitely pre-wash it first. Shrinkage sometimes does occur. And I'm using 2 different fabrics. I've striped on one side and kind of like a 70s retro print on the other side. So I'm getting there. I'm almost done. Again, I want this pillow to last for a while and not get super flat. So I'm trying to take the time. I figured if I'm actually doing this demonstration, I should probably make another pillow for our couch. We're always short on pillows. So I'm almost at the point where I'm stuffed enough. So then I'm going to show you how to hand sew it shut. Just going to go back and make sure I actually have some in each corner. I'm actually going to take this pole and make sure that I have some in the corners. Okay, so at this point I'm ready to hand sew. So the easiest thing when you're trying to hand sew this is, you can see where I finger pressed it is folds. So I'm going to push the stuffing in, and I'm going to bring the folds together. And if you do this part correctly, nobody, unless they're looking super close, would even be able to tell that you hand sewed it. So it will look like you sewed with the machine the whole way around. So what I was saying before is you have to make sure when you're going in the opening, you don't rip the fabric at that point. If you do, you can always hand sew it a little past that point. Okay, now I'm putting my pins in this direction just so that I don't get poked a bunch when I'm sewing this, and just to kind of hold it flat. So I got my hand sewing needle all ready to go. I have a knot at the end and my needle's in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a little bit, my back stitching is here. So I'm going to start a little bit back here and put my needle in. And then I'm going to come out of the fold about 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch before that back stitching, and I'm going to overlap it a little bit. So I'm going to put it through. If you do this part, the little tail that is with the string will actually get pushed down in your opening, so you won't have a knot showing on the outside. So I just stuffed that in there, and then I'm going to re-pin it. Okay, now I'm right-handed, so it's easier for me if I sew to the left. So I'm going to turn the pillow around because now I got to go back through my opening. So this is called a slip stitch or a ladder stitch. So I'm coming out of the fabric that's over here on the fold. So now I'm going to come into the stripe side and try and stay on the fold. Put my needle in there and pull. Now when I do that, you shouldn't really see much of a stitch because you went straight across your two fabrics. Okay, then I'm gonna go back across to the other fabric, staying on the fold, and pull. If you don't go straight across the opening, if you move down, you'll definitely see the stitches and it won't be tight. So you want to do pretty small stitches here so it's nice and secure and won't come out. And if you notice with my left hand, I'm actually pinching where I'm trying to sew, and that just gives me a good grip on it. So I'm going to come straight across into the striped. And then I'll show you at the end how to hide the knot. So we're just kind of, it's called a ladder stitch too, because if you look at it, it's almost like you're doing the steps of the ladder. So I'm going across, up, across, up. And if you stay up on the fold, then you won't see your stitches. If you come down here a lot lower, you'll end up seeing them. And this stitch works for any time that you want it to, when you're trying to sew an opening shut. Okay, now since I'm past the point where this pin is actually holding things together, I'm going to remove that. Pinch it again with my hand. You notice too, I just gave it a tug, and that's just going to make sure that my stitching back here is secure. So if you look, you can't really see that I hand stitched that unless you look super close. If I did the stitches even smaller, it would be harder to see. There's also lots of different hand sewing needles, so you want to make sure you pick one that's comfortable to sew with. There's some that are really long and some that are really small, some that have large eyes in them and some that have small ones. So you just have to find one that works for what you're doing. I don't ever recommend using this the super wide needles, because then it puts large holes into your fabric when you're sewing it. So I'm almost to the end of my opening. If you didn't do a good job or you feel like it's gonna come out, you can turn around, which I'll show you at the end, and go back over your stitching that you did. Let me take that last pin out. So I'm almost at the end, but what I wanted to show you is what, if I pull this apart a little bit, you can see how my stitches went. Okay, so there's a couple I went a little bit diagonal, but if I pull that, it looks pretty good. So 2 more stitches and I'll be back to where my machine sewing was. So you can see my machine stitching is right here. So what I'm going to do is go into the other side like I was. And just like at the beginning, we do want to overlap our machine stitching. So I'm going to go in here, come out here. Okay, so now I'm where the machine stitching is. So now I'm going to turn the pillow around again so that I can go back 1 or 2 stitches. So now I'm going to go back. So if you felt like yours is too loose, you can just basically do the whole thing going back. I'm just going to do a couple stitches because I got to knot it. So I'm going to end right where my last back stitch was, which is there. So now we got to knot it and hide our thread tail. So I'm going to go under a stitch. So you just have to find a stitch. So I found a stitch there. So my needle's under it. I'm going to go around the needle 3 times, and then I'm going to pull my thread. Okay, so that knotted it, and then I'm going to do that 1 more time just to make sure I get a good knot. Go around it, pull. Okay, now I don't want to just cut this because then all this will be out and people will see it. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your needle and you're going to go in the fabric next to where your knot is. Okay, and then you're just going to pull it out wherever, because we're going to cut it in a second. So if you look, my knot that's there, if I pull, it hides the end. And then I'll pull here and cut. Now my thread end is hidden in there. That's where my hand stitching was. So from far away, you probably can't even see that I hand stitched it. And now my pillow is done. So like I said, you could do any size or shape of that. So I'm going to stick that over there on the couch. So let me show you a couple stitches. Let me get a fabric that I can actually, that you'll be able to see the thread on. Okay, so the one stitch that is going to be really secure and is going to be great for if you're sewing a pillow or anything that you need to make sure that it stays is called a back stitch. Now you would do this obviously with your, well actually I'll do it with my right sides together. Okay, and when you're beginning, it probably would help you if you made some marks on here so that when you're sewing it, you actually get on the marks. So let me see if this shows up. No. Okay, so since this is just a sample, I'm going to mark with this permanent marker. So let's say you were sewing here. So I'm just going to put some dots so that I can explain how to do the stitch. If I was doing a pillow, I would probably do them even closer together, but this will be good enough to show you. So you'll start get your needle and thread all good with knots on the end. And it's called a back stitch because what you're going to do, if I'm sewing to the right, I'm actually going to go back a dot and then come up the next dot. Go back a dot, come up the next one. Go back a dot, come up the next one. So on the front side of the fabric, it's going to look like any stitching that you see on a machine. So the stitches are going to be connected to each other, but then when you look on the back, they're going to be overlapping. So if I was doing the back stitch, I would start on my first dot. So come up through where that dot is, pull until it won't pull anymore, and then I'm going to go back in the opposite direction that I'm sewing. Okay, then I'm going to come up through the next dot and then go in the fabric as close as I can to the very first stitch that I came out. And again, these are probably a little bit big. I would do them smaller. So then I'm going to come up the next dot. So every time you're doing a new stitch, you're coming up the dot after your last stitches. So I'll go in there, come up the next dot. Try not to pull it too much. Go in the fabric, one dot back. So this is called a back stitch. So again, on the front, they're going to look connected, but on the back, they're overlapping because your stitches on the back are twice as wide as the stitches on the front. So there's my stitch on the front. So the next stitch I would do would go through there. So that's one that I would recommend to do if you were doing a pillow. When you get to a corner, what I would do is go back. So if this was my corner here, I would go back to that stitch. Then I would come out here where the corner is, go forward, so I'm turning there, and then I would just repeat the corner stitch. Actually, I would come up here and then go back to the corner. So you have a double stitch there, and that'll just secure the corner. And you would make sure you leave your opening in the center for that as well. So that's how I would recommend doing the corner. Otherwise, you'll have a diagonal line in the back. Another stitch that you can do is called an overcast stitch. There's also a blanket stitch. But an overcast stitch is basically going in a circle around the edge. It's not as secure as the back stitch, but it would work. So what you do is you come up about 1/4 of an inch away from the fabric. You go around to the back, come up through. Go around to the back, come up through. So if you don't come up the same distance from the edge every time you do this, when you turn to the other side, it's not going to be super secure. But that is another stitch that you can do. The front and back pretty much look the same. So if you're hand stitching, and I would definitely recommend doing the even back stitch. You can find videos online for that. And then you could definitely do the overcast stitch as well, and that would help you. So if we look, if this was a pillow and we turned it, it's a little loose there. So if I did tighter stitches, it wouldn't look so loose. And I would obviously use a darker thread for this so you can't see it. So that's my demo for today. So hopefully you'll make some pillows, show me some pictures, and I'll see you all on Monday. Have a good night.